G'day guys, it's Taylor here from ADRENO Spearfishing, and today we're here to talk about how to choose the right spear for your spear gun, whether you're replacing or whether you are upgrading the spear in your gun. So a few of the basics that we're going to have a look at today when replacing your shaft is going to be determining whether you have a Euro or square notch mechanism gun. We're going to go through the basics of a fin or notch style of loading tab. We're going to have a look at the materials used in spears. And from there, last but not least, we're going to have a look at floppers versus threaded versus also your point types. So the easiest way for you to determine what style of mechanism your gun has is to look at your current spear or your old spear and have a look at the shape on the rear of the spear. Now, if it has a rectangular or square notch cut into the spear, that is your American style. So that'll be typically your hatch guns, your JBL or your Rife. Otherwise, if it has a half crescent shape, that is going to be a Euro style mech. Now that's going to cover most of your guns like your Bochet, your Rife Euros, your Pathos, your Rob Allen, and most of the guns that are imported into Australia. If you can't work that out yourself or you've lost your spear, I would definitely recommend just touching base with your local retailer or giving us a call. Now from there, we're going to have a look at the length, determining what length spear you need for your gun. Now you can go down a rabbit hole on this and look at how much overhang we need to have on your gun. Typically most of your manufacturers, they will come with a 400mm overhang. From your roller guns, they may only have 100 to 200mm overhang, so much shorter and much more compact. And then some guns will actually come with 500mm overhang. Now there's a few things we'll talk about down the track to have a look at why we choose different overhangs. So stay tuned with that one. So there's a few different reasons why we have a look at our overhang. It's going to really determine the sight picture that you're seeing when you're lining up on a fish. And that really does determine what length you want to have in your guns. Now, once we've worked this out, I want to make sure that every single one of my guns has a consistent overhang. So that way the sight picture is exactly the same and I should be as accurate and as consistent as I possibly can be. So most manufacturers will come with anywhere between 200mm to 500mm overhang. Your Rob Allens typically come with a 400mm overhang. So when we're talking about overhang, we're actually talking about the distance that the spear protrudes past the muzzle. So if we're having a look at a Rife Euro, you'll see here, typically if you measure from the end of the gun to the tip of the spear, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about overhang. Now Rife use a 500mm overhang. Rob Allen use 400. The likes of Manny Sub, Salvamar and a few other guys who are trying to keep their guns nice and compact are looking for shorter overhang. What that really does, especially in your roller guns, is it makes your gun compact and much easier for you to travel with. And if really you're finding yourself accurate with an overhang, make sure that you stick with that and keep that across all of your guns, no matter what the length is. Some little tips on that is that if you're finding that you're shooting high quite a lot or you're losing your fish quite often to a high shot, I would recommend increasing your overhang by about 10 centimeters or 100mm. And what that does is that will change that sight picture, subconsciously to the natural reaction of how you aim. And it will, by increasing that length, it's actually going to force you to tip that gun down that little bit further to bring it into line with your original sight picture that you're used to, without having to change your technique so much. So just by changing a tiny little bit of length on your spear can really change your accuracy on your spear gun. To determine what length spear you actually need, a lot of people talk about measuring your barrel length. Now for me, that isn't the most accurate way because there are so many guns now coming with reverse mechanisms. So that can actually increase the length that you need for your gun by at least 100mm. So what I mean by a reverse mechanism here, so this is a 120 Pathos. You can see that the spear engages behind the trigger, which typically, say a Rob Allen, it would engage on top of the trigger. So it brings these loading notches back even further. Now with that, you actually need to make sure that because you're moving the spear back further, that's going to shorten your overhang. And that again changes your sight picture. So if we have the equivalent in a Rob Allen, so we have a 120 and a 120, this one would have a 160 centimeter or 1600 mil spear in it. Now, if we went and pulled out the Pathos spear, that one's actually probably going to be a 170 spear purely because of that reverse mechanism. Because that reverse mech is bringing that shaft further back on the gun. So you can actually see on the spear guns and the handles themselves what I'm talking about there. You can see that the mechanism is much further back on the same length barreled gun. So because that mechanism is further back on the gun, it's going to increase the spear length on your Pathos. So in summary, when you're looking at the length of your shaft, what you want to do is you want to put the spear inside the gun and you want to measure the overhang past. So as I was mentioning, for Rob Allen's and a lot of South African guns, they're going to be a standard 400 mil overhang. Your Rife Euros will be roughly a 500 mil overhang. Pathos will come off the shelf with about 300 mil overhang. Now for me, all of this can be changed to suit your shooting style. So if you pick up a gun and it's not actually shooting as accurate as you think, it could be because of the technique, and all we have to then do is either lengthen the spear or even sometimes shorten the spear. So one thing to consider, whether you are using a pranger on your threaded spear or whether you're using a slip tip, is that when we're talking about spear overhang, we're talking about overall length. So if I'm going to use a slip tip on top of this, the entire length of the spear is what I am looking to measure, and we want to make sure that stays within your 400 or 500 mil overhang, or whatever you have predetermined you want your overhang to be. So in summary, you may install a threaded spear on your gun, but you need to make sure when you're measuring that overhang past the muzzle, you are ensuring that the overall overhang includes the pranger or the slip tip. So that means that the spear itself may be a little bit shorter and only 150, 200 mil overhanging the spear, but you know that as soon as you install that slip tip, you're going to get that 400 or 500 mil overhang. So now we've spoken about the length of your spear and determining how we want to choose the length. We're going to have a look at the spears themselves now. Not all spears are made equal. There's quite a few different materials used and quite a few different heat treatments used as well. So to show you the typical two styles of spears, you have a hardened or a heat treated stainless steel, and you have an oil quenched high carbon stainless spring steel. Now, there are two different benefits to these guys. These guys are quite more affordable. They are quite durable. You can see that they are quite flexible, so they can deal with lots of loads between your standard reef fish to wahoo, mackerel, things like that. They have a little bit more tendency to spring back and hold their original shape compared to a stainless spear that is a bit stiffer. Once you've bent a stainless spear, it will always have that memory within itself. You can actually straighten these, but it will never be as straight as what it was off the shelf. And once you have bent a spring steel or a carbon spring steel spear, it's pretty much dead to you. There's not much you can do with it. Replace that on the spot. With your high carbon steel spears, they're being oil quenched. That is effectively their treatment to finish the spear. Now with that, over time, in the water, in the back of the ute, you are going to wear that coating off, and that is typically when you'll start to see corrosion, a little bit of rust. Now, for me, that doesn't really matter. You're still going to have a really nice, usable spear that's straight, durable, and accurate. The biggest benefits of your high carbon spring steel spears is that they are quite flexible. They will be able to take a range of load from different species, whether it be your Spanish mackerel, wahoo, all the way down to your smaller snapper and things like that. Your hardened stainless steel spears are typically more accurate because they are stiffer. They're going to have less shaft wobble throughout the shot. But one of the biggest benefits I find is for those spear fishermen who don't get out quite as often as they like. These guys will not corrode. A good stainless steel spear, especially with heat treatment, should not rust. So every time you pick up that spear gun, it is ready to go, ready to roll, ready to get in the water and get you some fish. Whereas with these high carbon spears, they can corrode, they can get a little bit of rust on them, but as long as it doesn't affect the flopper and the freedom of that flopper movement, no stress at all. It does not affect your spear or your shot whatsoever. So the next thing we're going to talk about here is the thickness of spear that you want to use. Now, when I'm thinking about replacing my spear, I'm also thinking about the species that I'm going to be chasing. So whether I'm increasing or decreasing, there are going to be a few things we need to keep an eye on, like power bands, which we can talk about another time. But effectively, you have spears that come in 6mm, 7mm, 6.5, 7.5, 8, 7.1, you name it. But effectively what you need to understand is that if you increase the thickness of your spear, it is going to be a heavier spear, so you're going to need a bit more power. If you're going down in thickness to a thinner spear, it's actually going to be lighter and quicker. So with that, you want to make sure you're not overpowering that spear, so you may need to lengthen the rubbers on the gun. If it's been a little bit inaccurate, it could have something to do with the power you're putting into that spear. It could be the material. It could also be your overhang. So a few things to keep in mind when you're choosing a new spear for your gun. Typically, most of your spears that are under 7mm are going to be designed more so for your reef species. They're lighter, they're faster. As long as they have a nice sharp point, in my opinion, they are going to be your better spears. Once you go from a 7mm up, you're starting to look at bigger fish, bigger species, bigger backbones, bigger scales. And with that, we're looking for penetration. So the biggest differences in thicknesses is going to be weight versus speed versus penetration. So the heavier the spear, the slower your spear is going to be, the better your spear penetration on bigger species in particular is going to be. But as soon as you go thinner, you're going to see that that spear is going to be faster because it is lighter. So that means you should have better range throughout the shot. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the loading notch style on your spear. Now, what we need to determine is whether you have a closed muzzle gun like this guy here, or whether you have an open muzzle gun, like so. Now, if you have an open muzzle gun, you're in luck. You can use just about any spear on the market as far as talking about the loading notches. If you are using a closed muzzle gun, like the Rob Allen Nomad, you're pretty much cornered into only using double notch spears. Now, when we're talking about double notch spears, or notched spears, because they do come with 3 and 4 notches in them, we're talking about slits that are cut straight into the material. Now, these are quite compact and quite low profile, so they can be a little bit hard to get in there sometimes, especially if it's an older spear and you've really used it well. So typically, the notch spears are going to be used on closed muzzle guns, but people can use them in open muzzles as well. When we're talking about mini fin spears, we're talking about these two guys here. So if you are using loading notches like this, you want to make sure that your gun does not have a closed muzzle on it, as what you'll find throughout the shot on a closed muzzle gun is that your spear will wobble and sometimes hit your closed muzzle, snapping the muzzle off. Now, one of the biggest things we also need to look at is the size of the entry into your mechanism. So on some spears, we're talking about the thickness of the spear itself and the entry on the tang. Between the two different styles, notch and minifin, there are a few downfalls to both. In my opinion, I much prefer the minifin just because of how easy it is to load the bridle onto it. Also because of how much larger that surface area is, it doesn't really dictate how thin or thick my Dyneema bridle needs to be, whereas a double notch spear effectively won't take anything thicker than 1.8mm Dyneema, and sometimes, like, I want that bridle to last forever, I'm going to use a 2mm or 2.1mm Dyneema on my minifins, which I can't do on a double notch spear. On the double notch spear as well, what you'll see here is that to make the slit, they have to cut into the spear. So effectively, you're cutting into about 25 to 30% of the material. So that to me is a weak point. I have seen them snap there. It's not common, but it can happen. And you don't want that happening on the fish of a lifetime. From there, what we now need to have a look at is the size of the entry to your mechanism. Now, what that is going to dictate is whether you can rig your shooting line to the rear of the spear or to a hole further up the spear. So what I mean by that is that if you have a narrow entry to your mechanism like a rife, a spear like this, you will not be able to put the spear as well as mono or shooting line into the mechanism. So for me, if I was using this spear on a rife Euro, I would either have to grind the entrance to the mech narrower, or I would have to use a rigging hole that's further up the spear, like this guy here. If you have a rife Euro or a mechanism that is quite narrow, there are spears that are specifically made for those. And what you'll see is that tang at the end of the spear has just been ground in for you, and it will allow for you to have 1.8 mil, 2 mil, whether it's mono or Dyneema. It will allow you to rig to the rear of the spear, but also allow you to actually let it engage properly. Sometimes if I rigged Dyneema to this spear here, put it in my rife Euro, it would feel like it's engaged, but effectively it's just pinched inside the mechanism. So as soon as I go to load that power band, it's actually going to pop straight out because that sear isn't engaged. So that is one thing to have a look at, is if you're finding when you're putting your spear into your gun and it's quite either hard or stiff, or you're finding it may be misfiring, it may be because you have too much thickness at the end of the spear and it's not allowing it to actually enter the mech freely. If you're finding that, what I would do is I would cut the mono off, chuck it back in your spear gun. If it engages, that's your problem. So what you can do with a spear like this is either grind it in or go out and get yourself a spear that has that done for you. So we're going to move on to the business end of your spear. We're going to talk about a few different points and a few different flopper styles that you'll typically see on your spears. The most universal spear used in Australia is a standard single flopper spear, typically with a tri-cut point. Now what we're talking about when we're talking about the tri-cut itself, you will see that that guy itself is shaped like a pyramid. Now these guys here are the most durable, as well as has the best penetration, especially through backbones of fish. Keeping in line with the flopper styles, we also have a double floppered spear here. For me, I really like these guys. It does put a little bit more drag on your shot by having an extra flopper or extra weight at the tip of your spear. But for me, I know that if I am getting if I get 2 floppers in, the odds are that at least one flopper is going to hold no matter what. We also then move on to the threaded tips. So these two styles are at opposite ends of the species list. If you're going for a heavier spear with a threaded tip, you're typically putting a slip tip on it, and you're going to be chasing yellowfin tuna, southern bluefin, marlin, wahoo, and fish of those species. But if you're using a 6 or 6.5 mil spear, you're going to have a pranger on this guy, and that will make chasing species like flathead and whiting a lot more efficient and a lot quicker, much, much easier. So we then move on to a drop barb spear. So this is effectively a one-piece integrated drop barb that is used to replace a slip tip or threaded style of spear. These are typically going to be used for those larger pelagic species like kingfish, southern bluefin, wahoo, and fish of those types. Now again, right at the business end, we're talking about the point tips. So the biggest difference we have here is a tri-cut tip versus a bullet point tip. For me, the tri-cut point is going to be the most durable, the best for your penetration, whereas your bullet point style is going to be much easier to bend the tip itself. It will then cause the spear to be less accurate. It is also much easier for you to sharpen your own spears yourself if you're talking a tri-cut point, because if you're using a file, it is much easier to use a standard flat surface to keep that point right in the middle of the diameter. whereas sharpening a bullet point is much, much harder with any standard hand tool.